I did the wrong intro then. That was the video for Matthew Power. Should have done the one with Joe. Anyway, whatever. I'll correct that later on. Welcome back to World War II TV, folks. One of my great joys hosting this channel is bringing on great friends and great historians to share their knowledge. And I'm bringing one on today. Joe Balkoski is both a friend and a great historian. As John McManus says, he is the greatest living D-Day historian, which is something of an accolade. He is the author of numerous books, and some of them are listed in the description below, mostly 29th Division, but turns his attention to other subjects as well. So delighted to bring him in. Good afternoon, Joe. How are you today?
Thank you, Paul. I'm doing very well. Lovely day here in Baltimore, Maryland, and thank you for having me on yet again.
It's been 3 years. I can't believe it. So the 29th Division has been, linked to your life for decades now, and we're now looking at this pre-D-Day thing, because we were just talking before going live. You've got the 29th Division, and you got the 1st Division. Inevitably, they're compared. They're compared as in terms of leadership. They're compared for their results, but they had very, very different routes to June the 6th. And so let's start with the 29th Division and how they arrived in England and when they arrived in England, and start it all off for us.
Okay. In order to really get the 29th Division when it arrives in England, you really have to look back to the stateside training period, and so many misconceptions about the 29th Division, which I will discuss at length in this hour. But the key fact that you have to know is that the division was mobilized. It was exclusively a National Guard division before Pearl Harbor, and it was called into federal service for what was supposed to be only 1 year in February of 1941, so 10 months before Pearl Harbor. And that is the only moment in the history during World War II in which the division is really a National Guard division. 100% of its members were National Guard soldiers from Maryland, Virginia, a smattering from the District of Columbia, and a very small contingent from Pennsylvania. But so many things you have to understand when the division was called up. Number one, within the first couple of months of its mobilization, they couldn't have stormed an island in the Chesapeake Bay, not to mention Normandy. Every single unit in that division was only at about 30% strength. And yet, its paper strength was about 25,000 men. It was about 140% the size of a British or German division. So really what you have to understand is this division went through 10 months of very solid training, but the key fact in that training is that it was infused with about 60 to 70% draftees. So it stops really being a National Guard division in the sense of its, fighting soldiers, but it retains a National Guard identity in terms of the leadership, staff. A lot of the people who had been in the Guard as privates would become the senior NCOs on Omaha Beach. So that is a very meaningful part of the story. It doesn't even go overseas until September 1942. So we're talking a year and a half of stateside training. And it was very, very vigorous training. And of course, your listeners probably well know that the division crossed on the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth. They made the journey in under 5 days, made it to Greenock, right outside of Glasgow. There's a great picture of the division coming ashore in Greenock. October of 1942 is really the first time they start to entrench themselves in Britain. I think the key thing you have to remember here is that they were the 4th U.S. Army division to arrive in Britain during World War II. They were preceded by the 1st Division, the 34th Infantry Division, which also was a so-called National Guard division, the 1st Armored Division, and then came the 29th Division. But if you look at the grand scheme of World War II history, the key thing that was about to happen when the division arrived in Britain was Operation Torch. It was about to be launched. And the 3 divisions that preceded the 29th to Britain were all called up for Operation Torch, and they immediately left for North Africa. There was serious consideration to bringing the 29th in to Operation Torch, but it was, I guess, my educated guess, it was more of a political decision that we needed to maintain at least one U.S. Army division in Britain throughout Operation Torch, and the 29th was the logical choice because it had just arrived. But this is, I'll stop in a second, but I just want to say that not a thought yet had ever been given by any member of the division to the ultimate role that it would play in Operation Overlord. That later, realistically, for a couple of months, it's actually considered a division that is going to help defend the coastline of Britain. And,
wow. As some of the Canadians were involved in that as well when they came over, that was their role. But I want to bring you back to the label of National Guard, because you've been associated with the Guard, professionally for most of your life as well. And when I see that in a reference in World War II, I see two meanings. There's a positive and a negative. The positive is community, tradition, men fighting for each other, strong bonds. That's, the same would apply to the British term of territorial. But there's also the other label is kind of amateur, part-time, not really professional. So when you see historians or people looking at that term, do you feel they get the real meaning of, as you say, what National Guard? Because you'll see it in June the 6th next month. People say the 29th National Guard Division landed on Omaha Beach. And as you said, they've long since left behind any sense of their pre-war identity. So what's your take on that term and what we understand it?
That's a great question. I mean, realistically, the National Guard of the United States between the wars was a troubled organization, and it wasn't so much the organization itself. It was the times. They're very, very difficult to get men to enlist. You drilled one night a week, but you got $1 for your drill. And, that didn't, even in the 30s, that dollar was not much. So, you were getting a very scarce portion of the populace. You were getting virtually no weapons of any cutting edge variety. And, essentially, the bottom line was that the nation was isolationist, so very little care was given to the training of the National Guard. But the real answer to your question is, once the international crisis erupts, the person you really have to look to is George C. Marshall. Marshall was the perfect man at the perfect time. He was a career soldier, of course, but he also had a very, very sensitive and good grasp of the National Guard. He worked for the Illinois National Guard for many years because Douglas MacArthur kind of cynically bumped him into that position to supposedly get rid of him. But when it became clear that this organization known as the National Guard was going to have to be used, he made it quite plain that anybody who was not up to snuff, and his standards were high, would be let go. So my idea of the National Guard is, once Pearl Harbor has occurred, anybody who is left in these so-called National Guard divisions is generally going to be a very good soldier, on a par with anybody from the active army, which is not to say the active army was completely proficient either, of course. But bottom line, Paul, is that by the time the 29th Division was getting ready to be shipped overseas, anybody who was in the division who was still a National Guard soldier was a top-of-the-line physical specimen, good soldier, very good trainer of troops, and particularly so at the staff level. If you look at the staff of the 29th Division, you get probably better people than you got in the active army. You got in the 29th Division, one of the most important members of the division was the G3 operations officer named Bill Whitty. He was a brilliant Johns Hopkins University electrical engineer, longtime member of the National Guard, very, very brainy. And this is the person that General Gerhardt would call my Napoleon. This is the man who took every crazy idea that General Gerhardt had, and believe me, he had a lot of crazy ideas, and he converted them into reality. But Whitty was just one of dozens of people that survived the National Guard purges and ended up being in the position that they were best qualified for. So many of them. So my opinion is, as of D-Day, number one, as you point out correctly, there is no really such thing as a National Guard division, but those people who were still National Guard veterans in the divisions were top of the line soldiers.
Brilliant answer. And you mentioned Gerhardt there, but before we bring up him, Rob Crane is asking, so this staff that you're talking about, were they the officers full-time pre-war? So these people that are making this fantastic team there, are they pre-war regulars, or are they National Guardsmen themselves?
You mean at the time of mobilization, or at the time of
at the time of mobilization? Yeah,
at the time of mobilization, that's a great question, because when mobilization occurred, there was an absolutely severe, critical shortage of officers. The number of officers in the 29th Division who survived the George Marshall weeding out process was very, very small. A lot of them were over age, and it was well known from Marshall that it was going to be a young man's war. They were overage. They were not physically fit. The very first thing that the Maryland National Guard did upon mobilization is it took something like 150 non-commissioned officers who were smart guys, and they put them in the Lord Baltimore Hotel, a fancy hotel in downtown Baltimore, and they gave them a 6-week class on becoming an officer. And these 150 NCOs were virtually overnight turned into second lieutenants. And you might laugh at that, but these are men typically who had joined the Guard in the 30s. They were good soldiers, and they ended up, many of those 150 end up landing on Omaha Beach. So of the surviving officers before that 90-day course, or 6-week course, excuse me, there were some great officers. They were, it was a bit of a watershed in U.S. military history. We were starting to accept, and I'm sure this issue was seen in the British Army as well. It was more common to have enlisted men rising to officer rank, and some of the great officers in the late 30s in the 29th Division were actually promoted from enlisted rank. And again, many of those play a role on D-Day. One of them ends up leading the 29th Ranger Battalion, Randy Milholland. But yeah, so it's a great question. I mean, the officers that survived the weeding out process and those that were suddenly turned into officers almost overnight, they're really how you look at the officer corps in the 29th Division as of D-Day. Thank you.
So let's turn our attention to Gerhardt, because there are some units where you kind of use the commander's name when you announce them. So it's never the Third Army. It's always Patton's Third Army. And Gerhardt has this sort of same Gerhardt's 29th, but he wasn't their first commander. But from my point of view, and I'll let you expand on it, does he revolutionize the way the 29th Division had been? Is it evolution, revolution? Tell us about how he comes and joins the team.
It's revolution. That's a great point. And it's partially not strictly due to his temperament. It partially is due to the events that were occurring around the world and the political decisions that were being made about Allied grand strategy. But Gerhardt arrived in Britain in July 1943, so the division had not yet been there a year. Its former commander, Leonard Giroux, who we all know is actually the man who leads the Omaha Beach invasion as commander of 5th Corps. So he takes over from Giroux. But July 43, when Gerhardt arrives, is an absolutely pivotal moment in the history of the American Army in Britain. Why? Because it is really at that time that the realization hits the American Army in Britain that Overlord is going to be the 100% focus of what you have to do. You know, at the Casablanca conference in January 43, pretty much the agreement was that 44 was going to be the year of the Northwest Europe campaign. And then in May of 43, in the Washington conference, they pretty much agreed that Frederick Morgan's Cossack plan was going to be accepted. And part of that Cossack plan is we were going to hit the shores of Normandy in 3 separate beaches. And so when the acceptance of Cossack was disseminated throughout the army, it became very, very obvious that the 29th Division was going to be a leading element in that plan. So you ask, why was Gerhardt's arrival a revolution? Well, immediately he embarked on amphibious warfare training that realistically ends up being probably the most thorough amphibious warfare training that any American unit has ever undergone. Exception of the Marine Corps in the Pacific, but comparable to that for sure. So the story goes that when Gerhardt arrived in Britain, he had formerly commanded the 91st Division, which was in Oregon at that time. He flew over to Britain with his aide-de-camp, and he had a very simple set of orders from Jake Devers, who was the European theater commander at that time. And he said, Gerhardt, you have 3 missions. He said, first, you have to make sure the 29th Division is disciplined. He said, I looked at their records right now, and too many of their men are in the guardhouse. He would act on that. He said, second, you know that the invasion of Europe is going to occur sometime in the spring of 1944, and you are to prepare for that. And he would act on that. And the third was rather comical, but it said your division will be stationed in Devon and Cornwall, and you will have a lot of troops in the Plymouth area, and Lady Nancy Astor is a member of Parliament there, and as you know, she is a Virginian by birth and later became first female member of Parliament. He said, you are to keep her happy and make sure that she, you just make sure she's entertained and make sure she understands that you have a nice American unit from the same neck of the woods that she was born in. And he did that as well. So anyway, the evolution really becomes revolution because the embarkation on the amphibious warfare training is intense. And we can go into some of those exercises. You see great photos of some of them.
Yeah, we can talk about that. Yeah, I mean, there's lots more questions I'm going to ask you, and we'll get to them in due course. And because we've talked about it before, I'm sure as well, you and I, is Gerhardt and Kota, legendary figures in Normandy, and to me they're yin and yang. They're Laurel and Hardy. They have each other's. They have the strengths the other one doesn't have, and you can't look at them without looking at them as a team, and then the others around them. And Gerhardt's important, but there's this incredible staff around him as well that I think makes the 29th and indeed the 1st, which we'll talk about tomorrow, kind of exceptional. They've got a good team of solid people.
Well, Norman Kota doesn't arrive. Great point. They did make Gerhardt and Kota made the perfect command team, the antithesis and the synthesis, so to speak. I mean, they were opposites, and it worked out. Kota didn't arrive until January of 44, but I will say, you know what, I should tell you the famous story that most people don't know of Gerhardt's arrival. He when one looks at Gerhardt, it's very easy to assume that he was hated. Having been in this field for long enough that I knew many of the field grade officers, including regimental commanders, as friends of mine, I can tell you that he was hated by some and he was adored by some. And when he arrived in the division in July 43, many people in the division were very demoralized. They were demoralized by an incessant training schedule with very, very few furloughs and very, very few breaks. There were practically mutinies in some of the battalions of the 29th Division at that time. When Gerhardt arrived, he immediately gave a 5-day break to every single person in the division, which acted as a nice, how should I say, introduction to their new commanders.
It's like bringing the donuts in when you start in the office, isn't it? It's like your first day in the office. You bring a big tray of donuts in. Yeah, perfect.
Exactly. And, and part of my theory about Gerhardt is that it was actually the enlisted men who tended to like him. It was some of the officers and field grade people who really had their doubts about him. And the story that I'll tell was that the first general meeting that he held in Tavistock, right outside of Dartmoor, in early August of 43, he called in every field grade officer of the division into a large auditorium someplace in Tavistock. And he paced around the room while everybody was looking at their new commander, and he just was letting people judge him. And suddenly he banged an M1 rifle on the table, and he looked at them and started yelling. And he said, "A year from today, 1 out of every 3 of you that I'm looking at will be dead. And more than that will be dead if you don't know your jobs." And he said, "I'm sick and tired of you saying you can't train because it's raining, or criticizing a junior officer because of something he can't do when you can't do it." And he called all of the senior officers, regimental commanders and the artillery commander, up for a little interrogation, and he asked them the fundamentals of U.S. Army field manuals, tactical field manuals, and none of them could answer the questions. And he said, "I'm disgusted with you. You have to go back to your headquarters, and you have to learn everything that you need to know about how our tactics are going to work in this war. The Germans are going to be very, very formidable enemies. And if you don't do your job, you're going to lead to the deaths of hundreds of people." So essentially, Paul, you either regarded that as a jolt that the division needed, or some people who I spoke to said, "This man is insane." Anyway, that was the type of leadership that he was going to exert throughout the war. He very famously said, "It's our appearance that it's how people will judge us." The famous chin strap rule, as you can see from his photo. You were fined $5, a considerable sum in those days, if you didn't have your chin strap hooked. Many other rules like that. He at random would pick up soldiers and say, "Recite to me the U.S. Army Field Manual procedure for aiming a rifle." And if you couldn't name it word for word, you got a tongue lashing. And so one might say, this was the perfect definition of that new U.S. Army term that was cropped up during World War II, known as chicken shit.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, many, many people in the division accepted that as the price that had to be paid in order to make a unit that was adept at what it had to do. So I'll leave it at that.
I mean, we could go on a massive rabbit hole about how you create effective combat units. Because, like in the British Army, you have the Guards regiments that it's all bullshit. It's all the marching and the polishing and stuff, and yet they can perform admirably on the battlefield. Then you have the SAS, who are kind of more roguish and not so many uniform regulations, and they end up being a great unit as well. So there's no single process that creates good units of soldiers. There's different methods that have worked, but you mentioned Tavistock and Dartmoor there, and you sent me the photo of one of the tours there in Dartmoor, because every 29th Division memoir you read has at least 3 or 4, 7, 9 chapters about the weather and the rain and the misery and the walking over those hills. And one of the things I wanted to bring up is just, can you overtrain men? You know, they've got a long wait before D-Day is going to happen, and you're out night after night, day after day doing these exercises. You know, I mean, you can explain on what exercise they're doing, but can you sharpen people to too fine a point?
Yes, I think you can. I mean, because the sharpening, as you call it, you know, basically leads one to the conclusion that, well, when are we going to actually do what we're trained to do?
Yeah.
And if the wait is prolonged, you know, a soldier's morale could drop. You know, that I'm doing all of this and nobody's telling me when I'm ever really going to do it. And that was a common sentiment among many 29th Division veterans I knew. But I will say this, and you know, this will touch on a comparison of the 29th Division and the 1st Division. The 29th Division's training for amphibious warfare was absolutely top notch. I mean, early on in Gerhardt's tenure, every regiment in the division and all the artillery battalions and the engineer unit attended the U.S. Army Assault Training Center on the north coast of Devon, which was run by a fellow named Colonel Paul Thompson, who ends up playing a very pivotal role on Omaha Beach and was very severely wounded. Paul Thompson was a brilliant engineer, and he understood the challenges of amphibious warfare, and he understood that to really make it work, you had to kind of convert a conventional U.S. Army infantry regiment into an assault unit, and which is what was done. The 116th Infantry went through the Assault Training Center twice, which is clearly the reason why they were chosen to land in the first wave in the western sector of Omaha Beach. And I'll touch later on in the show about the dress rehearsal exercises, because they were virtually incessant starting in 44. So much so that the troops were getting fed up with them. And according to many people, many veterans I knew, some of them were actually under the impression, I don't know if I actually believe this, but they were under the impression that when they sailed off to Normandy, it was another dress rehearsal exercise. I'm sure you've heard that, Paul.
Yeah.
But anyway, to contrast with the 1st Infantry Division, in a nutshell, the 1st Infantry Division's amphibious warfare experience in World War II was practical. It was the real thing. It was the real thing. They lived it. They landed on the coast of North Africa. They landed on the southern coast of Sicily and then fought inland. And in contrast, the 29th Infantry Division's amphibious war training was theoretical. And it was a very different thing, obviously. Paul Thompson was studying the ways that amphibious warfare had actually been carried out, and he was trying to improve upon it. And the 29th Division, although green, was the beneficiary of the lessons that people like Thompson were learning. The 1st Division was learning them in reality, of course. Anyway, yeah, I mean, I hope that answers your question.
It does.
They were trained to a T, and basically they were waiting longer than they cared to wait to have the operation take place.
So my next question is going to be, at what point, well, you kind of hinted at it, but at what point do they know that it's going to be a regimental combat team going in Overlord rather than a division? I mean, for people who watching this, who don't understand, it's the same personnel. It's just how they're organized, but it's all around the landing craft and the getting them to the beach. So at what point does that become set as part of the training?
I think, you know, I'm not entirely certain of that, but it clearly has something to do with the arrival of Bradley from the Mediterranean theater. You know, Gerhardt and the division were training in Britain for a very, very long period of time. So you would have thought that it would have been, the arrangement on Omaha Beach would have been in the reverse, that the 29th would carry out the assault with an assault regiment of the 1st attached. But, you know, the sense from the Mediterranean was, and we can discuss this further if you wish, that the the benefit of having people who had seen bullets fly and leaders who had been in combat and staff who had actually been under stress, it was desirable to have them lead the show and have the just a portion of the 29th Division be attached to them, and then the 29th, come in the next day and do its bit. And that clearly was Bradley's influence, because Bradley, of course, was a Mediterranean general. They had this sense that the 1st Infantry Division, and you'll learn more about this tomorrow with Steve, was a unit that could handle chaos. And there's a great deal of truth in that. Even though, they had some command issues, as you've talked about in your show before. Terry Allen and Ted Roosevelt had been relieved for whatever reason you may care to believe. But, and even Eisenhower, who didn't really show up in Britain until early January of 44, he famously called the 1st Infantry Division his Praetorian Guard. And, when you think of a unit that way, you're not going to let the 29th Division lead the show and put the 1st Division in a secondary role. So I don't know exactly when it happened, but it no doubt happened sometime in early 44 when Ike and Bradley got together and said, look, we can't fail to mess up here. And the 1st Division at least has a track record of success. And, the 29th Division is great training. Charlie Gerhardt's my man, but who knows what they're going to do when the bullets start to fly. And anyway, that's my thinking.
Okay, thank you. We've got a great question from no, hang on, that wasn't the one. That one, here we go. From Sheldrake. Was there any cross-pollination between the 1st Division, 16th Infantry, and the 29th Division's 116th Infantry who would land together at Omaha Beach? You talked about the kind of the lessons being learned in the Mediterranean being passed on to the 29th, but was there actual officers and NCOs being exchanged at any point?
That's a great question. And, the surprising answer to that is no. I had never saw any interaction between the two units. And I mean, I've heard of anecdotal evidence that they passed each other in training. I mean, and I discussed some of these in my book. They had an entirely different philosophy of military discipline and protocol. And, here you have a 29th Division soldier who's fined $5 if he doesn't have his chin strapped hooked. A rule that would have caused a 1st Division veteran from North Africa to, burst into laughter. But on the other hand, when you looked at 29th Division soldiers and the extent to which they had been trained and the stresses that they had been put under in their physical training and their tactical training, they had some very negative views of the 1st Division. Out on the moors, when they passed each other, one of the first things 29th Division soldiers noted, as silly as this may sound, is that 1st Division soldiers were allowed to put rain hoods on their Jeeps and their trucks. And that was an absolutely cardinal rule against that in the 29th Division. There was no such thing as ever covering a vehicle with a rain hood. And how many people in the division remarked to me, I saw a 1st Division officer sitting in a Jeep reading a book under a rain hood. Do you realize what would have happened to me had Gerhardt caught me doing that? Different philosophies, but, very interesting point. I saw no cross-pollination evidence between the two assault regiments. But I will say this. Norman Cota, who was the assistant division commander of the 29th, who basically was the leader of the so-called Bastard Brigade, who came ashore on the western end of Omaha Beach, of course, was an icon in the 1st Infantry Division. So, with Cota in charge of the 29th Division sector, I feel that Hubner no doubt felt the 29th Division was in very, very good hands. But, no tactical trading off of ideas, as deficient as that may sound.
Okay, so thank you very much. Well, let's go back to the training again now, because and I don't think this photo is actually 29ers there, but it's representative of what was going on. There's all those various assault courses and invasion practice beaches all set up around the southwest of England. And you can only got to read in your book or Spearheading D-Day. They're being incredibly inventive, learning about satchel charges and Bangalore torpedoes and all that, all those methods of breaching off the beach and getting across there. And as you said, they're just doing it for weeks and weeks and months. But does that come at the expense of training for what's going to happen after a landing?
Well, that's the elephant in the room, Paul. I mean,
I knew I was going to invite that elephant in.
That's a question that has been debated for decades, and my take on that is that it was at the expense of what was going to happen. I mean, a minor example. Had we prepared for what was about to happen in Normandy, the famous hedge cutters on tanks, or the first use of the so-called javelins in front of the Shermans to bust up hedgerows, that would have been thought of in Britain, but it wasn't. I mean, that's just a microcosm. But this all boils down to Ike and the high command. Because I think there was an obsession among the Allied high command that it doesn't mean anything if the invasion is going to fail.
Yeah.
So in terms of our commitment of training time, if we can bust in the door, we're going to win.
Yeah.
And they neglected, maybe even knowledgeably neglected the sense of not preparing well for what was going to happen once the beachheads were expanded. I think Field Marshal Alan Brooke, who I believe led a retreat of a division in 1940, or it might have been a corps. Well, it through Normandy. He remarked on the hedgerows, and no doubt, that the whole concept of the bocage country was brought up on high command. But at the risk of repeating myself, I feel a conscious decision was made, rightly or wrongly, that training time commitment had to be overwhelmingly devoted to the, kicking in the door.
Yeah. When James Holland makes that point, when he's leading a tour in Normandy right this week, and he says that the simple, most important thing about June the 6th is don't fail. Get that, establish a foothold. Everything else will come after that. Everything else. The main thing is don't fail on that first day. Not that in history many amphibious landings have failed. They nearly always work to some extent, but don't fail. And I think that's, you can understand why that focus has been put on. Let's just make sure we get that beachhead and we get a mile or two inland. Everything else is on that. But Gary Giamara asked a question based on the classic book, Beyond the Beachhead. And if you haven't got Beyond the Beachhead, folks, on your bookshelves, it's an absolute indispensable must-have. The link is in the description below. So Gary is saying, in Beyond the Beachhead, you say, soon after landing, the men of the 29th discovered the infantry tactics they had been taught were in urgent need of modification. It's just continuing the discussion we've just had. So what would you want to expand on that?
Sure, that's a great question. Basically, this touches on what we were just talking about. How do you fight the enemy once the army is established ashore? Well, you fight the enemy based on the training manuals that the army produced in the early phases of the war. And when you reflect and read upon them and read them, they were certainly in need of modification.
Yeah.
So many elements really would not cut it when fighting the enemy in a very favorable defensive terrain. The U.S. Army and the British Army as well put heavy emphasis on overcoming the enemy by firepower alone, and typically infantry firepower. And we had learned in the Mediterranean, but we hadn't really disseminated the lessons very well. And we learned the hard way in Normandy again, that the firepower of the American army on the very lowest of the tactical levels was very deficient. We couldn't really compete with that German model of the small squads, each armed with an MG-34 or MG-42 machine gun, and the constant changes of position. And equally important, the German smokeless powder. What a difference that made. The Americans still didn't have smokeless powder. So every single time a GI leaning up over the top of a hedgerow fired an M1. You had a telltale projection of gray blue smoke, which gave the German machine gunners a perfect aiming target. And typically we put way too much faith in the M1, which General Patton famously described as the greatest battle implement ever devised. But it just couldn't alone cut it against the highly refined and very, very effective German low-level tactics. Now, that being said, we did learn well. It took 6, 7, 8 weeks to learn well with the combination of engineer, tank, infantry tactics. We ultimately did sort of learn our lesson. But one of the strengths of the American Army was that the artillery doctrine is really what saved us in the beginning of the Normandy campaign. I mean, American artillery doctrine was really quite superb, and it grew in efficiency and deadliness as the Normandy campaign went on, and then became almost the paramount element of American tactics by the time of the breakout, Brittany, the fighting on the German frontier. But yes, I mean, we had to learn to modify our tactics based on the hard lessons and, unfortunately, the thousands and thousands of casualties, which anybody who studies Normandy well understands.
No, brilliant answer, and your chapter about the analysis of those at the small level, because as you said there, at the high level, the Allies trump the Germans on pretty much everything. Air power, artillery, armored divisions. But at that low level, I mean, when the 29th and other units start, attacking some of the Fallschirmjäger held positions inland, where they've got, core company level mortars that are bigger than the American ones. They've got, as you say, lots of machine guns, lots of small arms, and it's all there controlled with themselves. Whereas the American British way is to call on support from regiment, from corps, from whatever, and that unfortunately takes time, and then you can't bring that power to bear necessarily in the confines of the hedgerows, which, as you said, no one was really prepared for. Yet, as you also said, everybody knew about them at the high level. I mean, that's the debate we'll be having for years, is why was that information not filtered down to those who would need to know? And I kind of always, my answer is always because of security. You could not put 2.5 million men through a hedgerow training course all through February, March, and April, just on the off chance of the enemy finding out that they're all going through a hedgerow course, and therefore they must be going to Normandy. That's what I put it down to.
A very cogent point, Paul. True. Yes.
I may be wrong, but I want to bring up, because you hinted at it earlier on about the Ranger Battalion that the 29th had, because that's a curious story, isn't it? And, I put a couple of photos up there, and because that was something that was, again, a really good idea, but it fizzled out. So for those who don't know about the 29th Rangers, give us a little thumbnail sketch, please.
Okay. The 29th Ranger Battalion was known by its official title as provisional, which kind of hints that it might not have been permanent. But it was formed in December of 1942 and ultimately disbanded in October of 1943, and I'll touch on why. But again, it goes to the point I made earlier, that in the first 10 months of the 29th Division's training period in Britain, nobody really understood that the division was going to ultimately storm the beaches of Normandy, or storm any beaches.
Yeah.
So it was very nebulous what this unit was going to do. And there was a general recognition in the Army that small units would be needed for special missions. And as you well know, there were 3 Ranger battalions involved in the Mediterranean campaign, the 1st, the 3rd, and the 4th. Many of the recruits from, I forget which one, if not all of them, were drawn from actually the 34th Infantry Division, which arrived in Britain before the 29th. But again, just as the 29th Division was left behind in Britain when Operation Torch occurred, a microcosm in the special operations side of things happened with the Rangers. All the Ranger units in Britain, in the American Army, went to the Mediterranean, so it was thought that we need one in Britain. and they asked for volunteers, and overwhelmingly, probably 95 or more % of the volunteers for this new unit were drawn from the 29th Division. Some were drawn from the Army Air Force. But the unit was trained, as your listeners probably know, by British commandos up in Auchnacarry, Scotland, which is, you know, one of the most beautiful but godforsaken places in the world. It's very, very remote. It's probably 120 miles north of Glasgow, maybe 60, 70 miles southwest of Inverness. It's right near Ben Nevis, which is the highest mountain in the British Isles. Anyway, the training period was intense, as this kind of photo hints. The British commandos, you probably have had somebody on your show before talking about commando operations, but British commando training, several times. I mean, British commando training was absolutely intense. And interestingly enough, these Green Americans adapted very well. They really did well, and the commandos were impressed. A handful of 29th Division Rangers participated in some raids. There's a lot of confusion about how many exactly, but some did. That picture there is of Major Randy Milholland. He was one of the men I mentioned earlier. He was an enlisted soldier in the Maryland National Guard from way out in Western Maryland, and rose to officer rank. Unusual in the interwar Army, but it was starting to happen. And a fantastic leader, ends up, I'm getting ahead of my story here, being one of the great field grade officers in the history of the 29th Division. But for the moment, he was picked to lead the 29th Provisional Ranger Battalion, and they couldn't have picked a better man. He was a soldier. He inspired enormous loyalty, and also somehow he managed to be, you know, a Gerhardt level trainer without the animosity that Gerhardt would trigger. So how does the story end, and why were they disbanded? Well, again, the story really relates to the crystallization of the role of the American Army in Britain. And that is, after the Washington Summit Conference in May of 1943, when Frederick Morgan's Cossack Overlord plan was accepted, it became very clear that the 29th Division, in one form or another, was going to be a leading component of Operation Overlord in the initial phase. And a general conclusion was reached: well, why are we sending out 400 of our best men when we're about to storm the beaches of Normandy, and these men are going to be needed? And that theory held weight. And, you know, it sort of was George Marshall's theory. It might have been heavily, I don't have evidence of this, but it might have been influenced by Marshall, who said, you know, any unit involved in Operation Overlord needs to be at its best. And there really is no justification to have 400, you know, grade A soldiers removed from the division at its pivotal moment in history. So the division was disbanded. The Ranger Battalion was disbanded in October of 43, and the men returned to their units for the most part. Some of the men actually went into the airborne. But I will conclude by saying that almost every one of these former Rangers ends up playing very pivotal roles in the units to which they return, and fighting on all the way through VE Day. So many of them, when you see the high-level decorations in the 29th Division, there's another 29th Ranger, there's another 29th Ranger. So in the end, it was a highly laudable and useful exercise, but in terms of practical purposes, the unit did not serve the purpose for which it was raised, but end up playing probably a more important role in terms of the personnel.
Brilliant answer, Joe. So I want to take you back to the training program, because it was the anniversary last week, 80th anniversary of Slapton Sands, Exercise Tiger, and throughout the training of the US Army as a whole in England, we see this obviously an upward graph of getting better and better trained for what's going to come ahead, but it doesn't all go with smooth sailing. I mean, Peter Caddick Adams makes the point in Sand and Steel that as many people die in the UK in training exercises for what became Overlord than actually died on the day itself, June the 6th. So were there any particular kind of bumps in the road for 29th Division in the year or so before D-Day?
Not really. Of course, what Peter said is true, but overwhelmingly that's due to Exercise Tiger. If I read what you're saying, I mean, Exercise Tiger was a calamity of massive proportions. But when done right, and I mean, obviously the Germans had something to do with Exercise Tiger too. There were precautions that could have been taken, should have been taken, but the bottom line was they caught us with our pants down. But no. 29th Division exercises, many of them, from late 43 all the way up until May of 44, were carried out pretty flawlessly. There were some hard lessons learned that made improvements in some of the amphibious warfare doctrine, but I'll tell you what, the series of exercises the 29th Division carried out progressively from small unit all the way up to division were Exercise Duck, Exercise Fox, many Exercise Foxes, and then the ultimate ones were Fabius. Fabius really were the dress rehearsals for not only Omaha, but Gold, Juno, and Sword. Tiger was interesting. It was independent of Fabius because Utah was kind of a standalone operation. Fabius was a dress rehearsal on Slapton Sands, and it was carried out flawlessly. And so my opinion is, I mean, that's one of the reasons why you consider a division an amphibiously trained division, is that when they can carry out these exercises and do so that you know that when their moment in the sun happens, they'll at least carry it out competently. And I should point out, Paul, that at the time that Ike and Bradley could have made the decision about who will lead the American army ashore in Normandy, he had four choices. They had four choices. Yeah. The four divisions in Britain that were trained at a high amphibious level were the 1st Division, which, as we said, had practical experience, the 4th Division, which much of its amphibious warfare experience, training experience, was from the stateside, the 29th Division, which had all its experience in Britain, and here's the division that you may surprise your listeners. The 28th Infantry Division was also considered to be a leading element in Overlord, but it was very, very plain that the 29th Division had gone through these exercises and the Assault Training Center at a much higher level than the 28th. And consequently, it's not surprising that they were chosen. But short answer to your question, those exercises were absolutely pivotal. Peter makes a great point. The casualties of Exercise Tiger were tragic. I mean, infinitely more than were lost on Utah on D-Day. But you have to tip your hat to the Germans for that one. Mm-hmm. They caught us when we were not ready, and we didn't let it happen again.
Oh, thank you, brilliant response. So I want to take you back to the core lessons of the 29th experience in England and before that in the USA, because when you look at some of the other divisions that fought in the Normandy campaign, not just America, I'm thinking of the British 59th Division. There were crisis moments they faced later on, crisis moments of morale, crisis moments of leadership. The American 90th Division has numerous crisis moments in Normandy. The 29th, to me, doesn't, despite the learning curve of the hedgerows, to me, doesn't have any crisis points. It has lots of terrible combat and it has lots of hurdles to overcome. But at the heart, for me, is a very, very well organized division with very, very good junior leadership and high leadership. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would, very wholeheartedly. And I think this relates, at least in part, to what I talked about at the beginning of the show. And that was when we discussed what it meant to be a National Guard division. Well, to reiterate, the National Guard division was divisions in the U.S. were heavily weeded out, and the residue that was left was a highly talented bunch of people. And as I touched on, that you might have even said that they were better than their active army components. Of course, there was no distinction anymore in 44 between, somebody like who was the chief of staff of the 1st Division? I forget it. Oh, Stanhope Mason and William Whitty of the 29th Division, the G3. The reason I believe that the 29th Division doesn't have these crisis points, for the most part, is that staff work of these brilliant people who survived the Army's weeding out process. They were really intelligent, good leaders and good thinkers. As I said, Gerhardt called his G3 my Napoleon. And had Gerhardt not had people like that, I believe there would have been the crisis that you mentioned easily. And Gerhardt probably would have been relieved. But he had rational people who could take his sometimes irrational directives and make them rational, if that makes any sense. And honestly, you're right. The 29th Division did not have crises. It had some leadership crises in that Gerhardt was basically relieved of command, but in late 44. But I turned it over and said, no, you're not going to relieve this guy. And Gerhardt had many personal issues that were caused many problems with General Bradley, which we can go into in a future show. No, the division was run very competently compared to the divisions you mentioned, like the 90th constantly getting into trouble, many others getting into trouble. But, they also turned it around for the most part. So.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, the British 51st Highland Division has been really fantastic in North Africa. Then they come to Normandy, a bit of a wobble, and that's an understatement. But they get better. They change a leadership, a change of direction, and get back on track again. And by the end of the war, they're one of the better units. But I want to end by really talking about these definitions again, because we talked before going live. We talked in the show about National Guard, regular. What is an elite unit? When does the unit become elite? What is it judged by their results? Is it judged by their lack of losses? When we as we inevitably will next month be talking about DDay and Operation Overlord and comparing these two divisions, do you see any real difference, fundamental difference in the results or aims between the 29th and the 1st?
Not really. No, I mean, basically, when push comes to shove and you had to learn war the hard way, and of course the 1st had already learned it the hard way, the 29th Division would just follow in their path and also learn it the hard way. And as we were discussing earlier, the experiences of the two divisions on June 6th itself were virtually mirror image. I mean, they were identical in terms of the paths they had to take in order to achieve tactical success. But no, I mean, I don't really see much difference. And remember that, the Army was already recognizing that leadership was key, and that putting people in leadership and staff positions that knew what they were doing was really the road to success. And the 1st and the 29th were both equally good in that department. So not sure if that answers your question.
It does. And I think the same could be said of the British units. I mean, there's the 3rd on sword, who, yes, they'd been involved in 1940, but virtually none of the same personnel was still there by 44. And you have the 50th on gold, who've been there and done it and had a very similar pass to the American 1st Division. Yeah, similar results, similar achievements, similar game. There's not much between them. But before we bring things to an end, is there anything else about that period in England or landing in Scotland, moving to England, that you think we haven't covered that you think is pertinent to get across today?
Yeah, kind of personal matter. One of the interesting facts is that the 29th Division was present in the British Isles for longer than almost any American unit. I mean, comparable to some of the Army Air Force bomb groups. But I mean, what that means is that when I first got into the 29th Division 45 years ago, and you went to 29th Division reunions, you heard many wives with English accents. And it's interesting that, you know, the division really has a core in its division Veterans Association of that stay in the British Isles. You know, the families that were created from marrying English women, the cousins that remain over in Britain. Interestingly enough, a couple, not that many, 29th Division veterans after leaving the Army decided to stay in Britain after marrying English women, and they ended up raising families and now having their little roots set up there. So that in that sense, the division stay in Britain was kind of unique.
It's funny you mentioned it, because I was thinking of asking you that, because it does seem that there are these extraordinary bonds. You see the same with some of the the 8th Air Force units over in East Anglia, where these great bonds were established. But that's probably because the ground crew is always there. But yeah, there are some units seem to create a bond with their community. But a brilliant question from Michael Ackerman, who is doing extraordinary work researching Omaha Beach, and be on next month talking about Omaha with us again. So he's saying, hi, Paul and Joe. When it came to combat training, do you know if the mock fortifications were based on actual German positions on Omaha Beach that were observed in recon photos, or were they random? That's a really good and quite niche question.
They were not really based on the actual fortifications, because the Assault Training Center was created early enough so that we didn't really have that great of a knowledge of what was yet done on Omaha Beach. And of course, there wasn't really the certainty yet where the 29th Division was going to land. I mean, they were just picked to have a role in Overlord. There is some talk that later on in the latter stages of amphibious warfare training, that some pillboxes and some of them evidently may still survive in Britain on some of these training sites.
Yep, they're there. Yep.
Yeah, have you seen some, Paul? Yeah.
Yeah, some of the ones in, I think it's Sussex, are still pretty identical to the ones in Normandy, but they were built later. Then there's the ones in Devon and Dorset that, as you say, are a bit earlier. But some of them seem to be really quite accurate. But as you say, they were building these things over a period of 12 months, 18 months. So the information got refined, as we know from studying the bigger maps. They start off with we're going to be landing somewhere and there'll be some sort of defenses. And then by the time you get to June 44, there'll be 3 strands of barbed wire here. And, the information is constantly being built on. So, yeah, that's an interesting answer. We've got another couple of questions for you, if you don't mind. Then
sure.
And I'm going to reword this one. Dennis is asking about the regional nature of the National Guard units contributing to some instances of proportionally high casualties. So, obviously, the Bedford Boys is the number one story everyone knows when we think of people from the same the area. In the First World War in Britain, we have the PALS battalions of going over the top, and all these guys in the same communities. Did that have? I know there's a lot of, you said yourself, there's a lot of draftees coming in. That the regional nature has changed a bit, but can that be a weakness at times if you've got lots of people from the same area and then you do have heavy casualties? Can that affect both the morale of the unit and the effect back on the home front?
That's a good question. It depends. Remember that the National Guard area over which the 29th Division was recruited from is a vast geographical area, and it encompasses giant urban centers and it encompasses tiny little towns. So it's a mixed answer. Bedford had the misfortune of having a company that had survived more intact than the typical 29th Division rifle company. I mean, by saying more intact, it probably was still 20% National Guard as of D-Day, which was very high, very high. There were some that were down in the 5 to 10% range. And Bedford being a very, very small town, and the Company A getting the assignment of landing in a very tough area in the very first moments of the invasion, you had the perfect storm. You had a town of only 2,500 people with a company that was pretty marginally intact. that was going to happen. But, you know, in terms of National Guard units raised in the city of Baltimore or in even some of the more substantial towns in Maryland and Virginia, no, that would not have had an impact, you know, because kids from Baltimore were being killed all over the place. And the units were had been weeded out enough so that you only had, in a company of 200 men, you might have only had 20 kids from Baltimore. And, you know, and of course, those units never got the short straw that Company A from Bedford got on D-Day. Something like that didn't happen again. So.
No, thank you. And then one last question, then we'll let you go. And it's going to be for my question. It's so many books about Overlord pretty much start with men in the landing craft heading towards that shore, or aircraft flying over. I'm assuming you think it's important to understand how any of these units got to that position first, how they were founded, how they were created, how they were trained, because it's without that, in a sense, character development, you can't understand what they're facing. Would you agree with me?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, as we just said, Paul, you know, in terms of the grand accomplishments of the 1st Division and the 29th and many other U.S. and British divisions, you know, you had a similar pattern of success, but you know, in every army unit is unique. Yeah. You know, in particular, the U.S. Army, even when they turned into overwhelming draftee divisions, every one had a unique story. And you know, one of the things I neglected to mention is even though the National Guard elements in the 29th were heavily weeded out, what I neglected to mention is before Pearl Harbor, when you know, something like 15,000 to 16,000 draftees were pumped overnight into the 29th Division. Overwhelmingly, those men were from Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Delaware. So it didn't have the military heritage. These guys didn't have the heritage that the Guardsmen had, or the military acumen or discipline, but they had the geographical affinity. And that really is a story of the, and I'm sure all the British Army divisions that fought throughout Northwest Europe had that too. So
yeah, but, you know, we've talked about before that, you know, even with the British units, there's some of the Welsh units where on St. David's Day they would eat a raw leek as part of their tradition. Well, there's maybe only 10% Welshmen left in the unit now, but they do it anyway because they've become Welsh. The same with the Northern Irish units or the Scottish, and I'm sure that we've talked about it with some of the, you know, the other supposedly National Guard units, that, you know, men from New York are picking up the Oklahoman traditions, or because they are feeling part of this community they've become part of, and the regular just sort of numbered divisions that are all just created out of a kind of a lotto, they maybe don't have that core identity that helps you when the chips are down.
You know, the fellow whose photo you had on the picture for today's show was Hal Baumgarten.
What a legend.
Classic case of what you just said. He was a Jewish kid from New York City, drafted into the 29th Division, and there could have been no more loyal 29er than Hal Baumgarten. And, you know, and that's why every Army division is unique. And you know, with all of Gerhardt's faults and all of his difficulties, he created an aura that really, really was powerful, enduring, and just really, really meaningful to the men as they got older. When they were 29th Division veterans and they hit the age of 70 and 80, they thought they were hot stuff.
Yeah.
And of course, people you get it.
I was going to say, I remember when when you were bringing over busloads of veterans, and I was seeing busloads of veterans. Some of the Americans would just have the World War II veteran hat. The 29ers always had the blue and gray and the regimental crest and another 29th patch on their sleeve, and then on the back of their jacket, and then train lights go like the 101st Airborne or British Commandos. There was always that. I'm not just part of the U.S. Army. I am a 29er. I am a commando, and that's something that you can't create that magic if it isn't there. Some units, as we know, they never had reunions. They never talked again. They just went on. Others, it's just that's they were the best years of our lives in some way. So anyway, we'll leave it there, Joe. I'm going to have to bring you back on again in August. I'm going to talk about the Brittany fighting, because I want to cover some more of the bringing fighting down there, and then maybe in the winter we can talk about the 29th pushing into Germany. I'm not going to leave it 3 years before I invite you back, is what I'm saying.
All right, I'm ready. Just let me know.
Brilliant. Well, Joe, take care of yourself, folks. We're back in 2 more shows tomorrow, so keep an eye on the schedule. Like, click, and subscribe. Go and buy Joe's books if you don't have them already. Then you're missing out on a huge amount of information. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Joe, and thank you for your fantastic questions. I'll see you all tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.